As the result of these and other reflections, being quite at home in matters of this kind, she sensibly decided to say nothing about the business to anybody, not even to her father. Late one night, soon after the 20th day of the 8th month, the princess sat waiting for the moon to rise. Though the starlight shone clear and lovely, the moaning of the wind in the pine tree branches oppressed her with its melancholy, and growing weary of waiting, she was with many tears and sighs recounting to Myobu stories of bygone men and days. Now was the time to convey Genji's message, thought Myobu. She sent for him, and secretly, as before, he crept up to the palace. The moon was just rising. He stood where the neglected bamboo hedge grew somewhat sparsely and watched. Persuaded by Myobu, the princess was already at her zithern, so far as he could hear it at this distance. He did not find the music displeasing, but Myobu, in her anxiety and confusion, thought the tune very dull and wished it would occur to the princess to play something rather more up-to-date. The place where Genji was waiting was well screened from view, and he had no difficulty in creeping unobserved into the house. Here he called for Myobu, who, pretending that the visit was a complete surprise to her, said to the princess, "I am so sorry. Here is Prince Genji come to see me. I am always getting into trouble with him for failing to secure him your favor. I have really done my best, but you do not make it possible for me to give him any encouragement. So now I imagine he has come to deal with the matter for himself. What am I to say to him? I can answer for it that he will do nothing violent or rash. I think that considering all the trouble he has taken, you might at least tell him that you will speak to him through a screen or curtain." The idea filled the princess with consternation. "I should not know what to say to him," she wailed, and as she said the words, bolted towards the far side of the room with a bashfulness so infantile that Myobu could not help laughing. "Indeed, madam," she said, "it is childish of you to take the matter to heart in this way. If you were an ordinary young lady under the eye of stern parents and brothers, one could understand it, but for a person in your position to go on forever being afraid to face the world is fantastic." So Myobu admonished her, and the princess, who could never think of any argument against doing what she was told to do, said at last, "If I have only to listen and need not say anything, he may speak to me from behind the lattice door. So long as it is well locked, I cannot ask him to sit on the servant's bench," said Myobu. "You really need not be afraid that he will do anything violent or sudden." Thus persuaded, the princess went to a hatch which communicated between the women's quarters and the stranger's dais, and firmly locking it with her own hand, stuffed a mattress against it to make sure that no chink was left unstopped. She was in such a terrible state of confusion that she had not the least idea what she should say to her visitor, if she had to speak to him, and had agreed to listen to him only because Myobu told her that she ought to. Several elderly serving women of the wet nurse type had been lying half asleep in the inner room since dusk. There were, however, one or two younger maids who had heard a great deal about this Prince Genji and were ready to fall in love with him at a moment's notice. They now brought out their lady's handsomest dress and persuaded her to let them put her a little to rights, but she displayed no interest in these preparations. Myobu, meanwhile, was thinking how well Genji looked in the picturesque disguise which he had elaborated for use on these night excursions, and wished it were being employed in some quarter where it was more likely to be appreciated. Her only consolation was that so mild a lady was not likely to make inordinate demands upon him, or pester him with jealousies and exactions. On the other hand, she was rather worried about the princess. What, thought Miobu, if she should fall in love with him, and her heart be broken merely because I was frightened of getting scolded? Remembering her rank and upbringing, he was far from expecting her to behave with the lively pertness of an up-to-date miss. She would be languorous, yes, languorous and passionate, when, half pushed by Miobu, the princess at last took her stand near the partition where she was to converse with her visitor. A delicious scent of sandalwood invaded his nostrils, and this piece of coquetry at once raised his hopes. He began to tell her with great earnestness and eloquence how for almost a year she had continually occupied his thoughts. But not a word did she answer. Talking to her was no better than writing. Irritated beyond measure, he recited the verse, if with a vow of silence, thus 10 times, and again, my combat I renew, 'tis that against me, at least no sentence of muteness has been passed. Speak at least one word of dismissal, he continued. Do not leave me in this bewilderment. There was among her ladies one called Jiju, the daughter of her old nurse. Being a girl of great liveliness and intelligence, she could not bear to see her mistress cutting such a figure as this, and stepping to her side, she answered with the poem. The bell had sounded, and for a moment silence was imposed upon my lips. To have kept you waiting grieves me, and there let the matter rest. She said the words in such a way that Genji was completely taken in and thought it was the princess who had thus readily answered his poem. He had not expected such smartness from an aristocratic lady of the old school, but the surprise was agreeable, and he answered, Madam, you have won the day, adding the verse. Though well, I know that thoughts unspoken count more than thoughts expressed. Yet dumb Crambo is not a cheering game to play. He went on to speak of one trifle or another, as it occurred to him, doing his very best to entertain her. But it was no use, thinking at last that silence might, after all in this strange creature, be merely a sign of deep emotion. He could no longer restrain his curiosity, and, easily pushing back the bolted door, entered the room. Miobu, seeing with consternation that he had falsified all her assurances, thought it better to know nothing of what followed, and without turning her head, rushed away to her own apartments. Jiju and the other ladies in waiting had heard so much about Genji, and were so anxious to catch sight of him, that they were more than ready to forgive his uncivil intrusion. Their only fear was that their mistress would be at a loss how to deal with so unexpected a situation. He did indeed find her in the last extremity of bashfulness and embarrassment. But under the circumstances that, thought Genji, was natural, much was to be explained by the strict seclusion in which she had been brought up. He must be patient with her. As his eyes grew used to the dim light, he began to see that she was not at all beautiful. Had she then not one quality at all to justify all these hopes and schemes? Apparently not one. It was late. What was the use of staying? Bitterly disappointed, he left the house. Miobu, intensely curious to know what would happen, had lain awake, listening. She wanted, however, to keep up the pretense that she had not witnessed Genji's intrusion, and though she plainly heard him leaving the house, she did not go to see him off, or utter a sound of any kind. Stealing away as quietly as possible, he returned to the Nijo Inn and lay down upon his bed. This time at least, he thought he was on the right path. What a disillusionment! And the worst of it was that she was a princess A great lady. What a mess he was in. So he lay thinking, when to know Chujo entered the room. How late you are, he cried. I can easily guess the reason. Genji rose. I was so comfortable sleeping here all alone that I overslept myself, he said. Have you come here from the palace? Yes, said Chujo. I was on my way home. I heard yesterday that today they are choosing the dancers and musicians for the celebrations of the Emperor's visit to the Suzaku Inn, and I am going home to tell my father of this. I will look in here on my way back. Seeing that Chujo was in a hurry, Genji said that he would go with him to the great hall. He sent at once for his breakfast, bidding them also serve the guest. 2 carriages were drawn up waiting for them, but they both got into the same one. You still seem very sleepy, said Chujo in an aggrieved tone. I am sure you have been doing something interesting that you do not want to tell me about. That day, he had a number of important duties to perform and was hard at work in the palace till nightfall. It did not occur to him till a very late hour that he ought at least to send the customary letter. It was raining. Miyobu had only the day before reproached him for using the princess's palace as a wayside refuge. Today, however, he had no inclination whatever to halt there. When hour after hour went by and still no letter came, Miyobu began to feel very sorry for the princess whom she imagined to be suffering acutely from Genji's incivility. But in reality, the poor lady was still far too occupied with shame and horror at what had happened the night before to think of anything else. And when late in the evening Genji's note at last arrived, she could not understand in the least what it meant. It began with the poem. Scarce had the evening mist lifted and revealed the prospect to my sight when the night rain closed gloomily about me. I shall watch with impatience for a sign that the clouds are breaking, the letter continued. The ladies of the household at once saw with consternation the meaning of this note. However, as a matter of fact, she looked as though without this monstrous wrapping, she would perish with cold, and he could not help feeling sorry for her. As usual, she seemed quite devoid of conversation, and her silence ended by depriving Genji also of the power of speech. He felt, however, that he must try again to conquer her religious muteness, and began making a string of casual remarks. Overcome with embarrassment, she hid her face with her sleeve. This attitude, together with her costume, reminded him so forcibly of queer, pompous old officials whom he had sometimes seen walking at funeral pace in state processions, hugging their emblems of office to their breasts, that he could not help laughing. This he felt to be very rude. Really, he was very sorry for her, and longing to put a quick end to her embarrassment, he rose to go. Till I began to look after you, there was no one in whom you could possibly have confided. But henceforward, I think you must make up your mind to be frank with me, and tell me all your secrets. Your stern aloofness is very painful to me. And he recited the verse. Already the icicle that hangs from the eaves is melting in the rays of the morning sun. How comes it that these drippings to new ice should turn? At this, she tittered slightly, finding her inability to express herself quite unendurable. He left the house. Even in the dim light of early morning, he noticed that the courtyard gate at which his carriage awaited him was shaky on its posts and much askew. Daylight, he was sure, would have revealed many other signs of dilapidation and neglect. In all the desolate landscape which stretched monotonously before him under the bleak light of dawn, only the thick mantle of snow which covered the pine trees, gave a note of comfort and almost of warmth. Surely it was such a place as this, somber as a little village in the hills, that his friends had thought of on that rainy night when they had spoken of the gate deep buried in green thickets. If only there were really hidden behind these walls some such exquisite creature as they had imagined. How patiently, how tenderly he would court her. He longed for some experience which would bring him respite from the anguish with which a certain hopeless and illicit passion was at that time tormenting him. Alas, no one could have been less likely to bring him the longed-for distraction than the owner of this romantic mansion. Yet the very fact that she had nothing to recommend her made it impossible for him to give her up, for it was certain that no one else would ever take the trouble to visit her. But why? Why had it fallen to him of all people to become her intimate? Had the spirit of the departed Prince Hitachi, unhappy at the girl's friendless plight, chosen him out and led him to her? At the side of the road, he noticed a little orange tree almost buried in snow. He ordered one of his attendants to uncover it, as though jealous of the attention that the man was paying to its neighbor. A pine tree nearby shook its heavily laden branches, pouring great billows of snow over his sleeve. Delighted with the scene, Genji suddenly longed for some companion with whom he might share this pleasure, not necessarily someone who loved such things as he did, but one who at least responded to them in an ordinary way. The gate through which his carriage had to pass in order to leave the grounds was still locked. When at last the man who kept the key had been discovered, he turned out to be immensely old and feeble. With him was a big, awkward girl who seemed to be his daughter or granddaughter. Her dress looked very grimy, in contrast with the new snow amid which she was standing. She seemed to be suffering very much from the cold, for she was hugging a little brazier of some kind with a stick or two of charcoal, burning none too brightly in it. The old man had not the strength to push back the door, and the girl was dragging at it as well. Taking pity on them, one of Genji's servants went to their assistance and quickly opened it. Genji remembered the poem in which Po Chui describes the sufferings of villagers in wintry weather, and he murmured the lines, "The little children run naked in the cold, the aged shiver for lack of winter clothes." All at once, he remembered the chilly appearance which that unhappy bloom had given to the princess's face, and he could not help smiling. If ever he were able to show her to no Chujo, what strange comparison, he wondered, would Chujo use concerning it? He remembered how Chujo had followed him on the first occasion. Had he continued to do so? Perhaps even at this minute he was under observation. The thought irritated him. Had her defects been less striking, he could not possibly have continued these distressing visits. But since he had actually seen her in all her tragic uncouthness, pity gained the upper hand, and henceforward he kept in constant touch with her and showed her every kindness. In the hope that she would abandon her sables, he sent her presents of silk, satin, and quilted stuffs. He also sent thick cloth, such as old people wear, that the old man at the gate might be more comfortably dressed. Indeed, he sent presents to everyone on the estate, from the highest to the lowest. She did not seem to have any objection to receiving these donations, which under the circumstances was very convenient, as it enabled him for the most part to limit their very singular friendship to good offices of this kind. Utsusemi, too, he remembered, had seemed to him far from handsome when he had peeped at her on the evening of her sudden flight. but she at least knew how to behave, and that saved her plainness from being obtrusive. It was hard to believe that the princess belonged to a class so far above that of Utsusemi. It only showed how little these things have to do with birth or station. For in idle moments, he still regretted the loss of Utsusemi, and it rankled in him, yet, that he had in the end allowed her unyielding persistency to win the day. And so, the year drew to its close. One day when he was at his apartments in the emperor's palace, Miyobu came to see him. He liked to have her to do his hair and do small commissions for him. He was not in the least in love with her, but they got on very well together, and he found her conversation so amusing that even when she had no duty to perform at the palace, he encouraged her to come and see him whenever she had any news. "Something so absurd has happened," she said, "that I can hardly bring myself to tell you about it." And she paused, smiling. "I can hardly think," answered Genji, "that there can be anything which you are frightened of telling to me. If it were connected with my own affairs," she said, "you know quite well that I should tell you at once. But this is something quite different. I really find it very hard to talk about." For a long while he could get nothing out of her, and only after he had scolded her for making so unnecessary a fuss, she at last handed him a letter. It was from the princess. "But this," said Genji, taking it, "is the last thing in the world that you could have any reason to hide from me." She watched with interest while he read it. It was written on thick paper, drenched with a strong perfume. The characters were bold and firm. With it was a poem. "Because of your hard heart only, the sleeves of this, my Chinese dress, are drenched with tears." The poem must, he thought, refer to something not contained in the letter. He was considering what this could be when his eye fell on a clumsy, old-fashioned clothes box wrapped in a painted canvas cover. "Now," said Miyobu, "perhaps you understand why I was feeling rather uncomfortable. You may not believe it, but the princess means you to wear this jacket on New Year's Day. I am afraid I cannot take it back to her. That would be too unkind. But if you like, I will keep it for you, and no one else shall see it. Only please, since it was to you that she sent, just have one look at it before it goes away." "But I should hate it to go away," said Genji. "I think it was so kind of her to send it." It was difficult to know what to say. Her poem was indeed the most unpleasant jangle of syllables that he had ever encountered. He now realized that the other poems must have been dictated to her, perhaps by Jiju or one of the other ladies. And Jiju, too, it must surely be, who held the princess's brush and acted as writing master. When he considered what her utmost poetic endeavor would be likely to produce, he realized that these absurd verses were probably her masterpiece and should be prized accordingly. He began to examine the parcel. Miyobu blushed while she watched him. It was a plain, old-fashioned, buff-colored jacket of finely woven material, but apparently not particularly well cut or stitched. It was indeed a strange present, and spreading out her letter, he wrote something carelessly in the margin. When Miyobu looked over his shoulder, she saw that he had written the verse, "How comes it that with my sleeve I brushed this saffron flower that has no loveliness, either of shape or hue?" What, wondered Miyobu, could be the meaning of this outburst against a flower? At last, turning over in her mind the various occasions when Genji had visited the princess, she remembered something which she had herself noticed one moonlit night, and though she felt the joke was rather unkind, she could not help being amused. With practiced ease, she threw out a verse in which she warned him that in the eyes of a censorious world, even this half-whimsical courtship might fatally damage his good name. Her impromptu poem was certainly faulty, but Genji reflected that if the poor princess had even Miyobu's very ordinary degree of alertness, it would make things much easier, and it was quite true that to tamper with a lady of such high rank was not very safe. At this point, visitors began to arrive. "Please put this somewhere out of sight," said Genji, pointing to the jacket. Could one have believed that it was possible to be presented with such an object? And he groaned. "Oh, why ever did I show it to him?" thought Miyobu. "The only result is that now he will be angry with me, as well as with the princess." And in very low spirits, she slipped out of his apartments. Next day, she was in attendance upon the emperor, and while she was waiting with other gentlewomen in the ladies' common room, Genji came up saying, "Here you are, the answer to yesterday's letter. I am afraid it is rather far-fetched." And he flung a note to her. The curiosity of the other gentlewomen was violently aroused. Genji left the room humming "The Lady of Mikasa Hill," which naturally amused Miyobu very much. The other ladies wanted to know why the prince was laughing to himself. Was there some joke? "Oh no," said Miyobu. "I think it was only that he had noticed someone whose nose was a little red with the morning cold. The song he hummed was surely very appropriate." "I think it was very silly," said one of the ladies. "There is no one here today with a red nose. He must be thinking of Lady Sakon or Higo no Unem." They were completely mystified. When Miyobu presented Genji's reply, the ladies of the Hitachi Palace gathered round her to admire it. It was written negligently on plain white paper, but was nonetheless very elegant. "Does your gift of a garment mean that you wish a greater distance than ever to be kept between us?" On the evening of the last day of the year, he sent back the box which had contained his jacket, putting into it a court dress which had formerly been presented to him, a dress of woven stuff dyed grape color, and various stuffs of yellow rose color and the like. The box was brought by Miyobu. The princess's ancient gentlewomen realized that Genji did not approve of their mistress's taste in colors, and wished to give her a lesson. "Yes," they said grudgingly, "that's a fine deep red while it's new, but just think how it will fade." And in Madame's poem too, I am sure there was much more good sense. In his answer, he only tries to be smart. The princess shared their good opinion of her poem. It had cost her a great deal of effort, and before she sent it, she had been careful to copy it into her notebook. Then came the New Year's Day celebrations, and this year there was also to be the New Year's mumming, a band of young noblemen going round dancing and singing in various parts of the palace. After the festival of the White Horse, on the 7th day, Genji left the emperor's presence at nightfall and went to his own apartments in the palace, as though intending to stay the night there. But later, he adjourned to the Hitachi Palace, which had on this occasion a less forbidding appearance than usual. Even the princess was rather more ordinary and amenable. He was hoping that like the season she too had begun anew, when he saw that sunlight was coming into the room. After hesitating for a while, he got up and went out into the front room. The double doors at the end of the eastern wing were wide open, and the roof of the veranda having fallen in, the sunshine poured straight into the house. A little snow was still falling, and its brightness made the morning light yet more exquisitely brilliant and sparkling. She watched a servant helping him into his cloak. She was lying half out of the bed, her head hanging a little downwards, and her hair falling in great waves to the floor. Pleased with the sight, he began to wonder whether she would not one day outgrow her plainness. He began to close the door of the women's apartments, but suddenly feeling that he owed her amends for the harsh opinion of her appearance which he had formed before, he did not quite shut the door, but bringing a low stool towards it, sat there, putting his disordered head-dress to rights. One of the maids brought him an incredibly battered mirror stand, Chinese combs, a box of toilet articles, and other things. It amused him to discover that in this household of women, a little male gear still survived, even in so decrepit a state. He noticed that the princess, who was now up and dressed, was looking quite fashionable. She was, in fact, wearing the clothes which he had sent her before the new year, but he did not at first recognize them. He began, however, to have a vague idea that her mantle, with its rather conspicuous pattern, was very like one of the things he had given her. "I do hope," he said presently, "that this year you will be a little more conversational. I await the day when you will unbend a little towards me more eagerly than the poet longs for the first nightingale. If only like the year that has changed you too would begin anew." Her face brightened. She had thought of a remark, and trembling from head to foot, with a tremendous effort, she brought out the quotation, "When plovers chirp and all things grow anew." "Splendid," said Genji. "This is a sign that the new year has indeed begun." And smiling encouragingly at her, he left the house, she following him with her eyes from the couch on which she lay. Her face, as usual, was half covered by her arm, but the unfortunate flower still bloomed conspicuously. "Poor thing, she really is very ugly," thought Genji in despair. When he returned to the Nijo Inn, he found Murasaki waiting for him. She was growing up as handsome a girl as one could wish, and promised well for the future. She was wearing a plain, close-fitting dress of cherry color. Above all, the unstudied grace and ease of her movements charmed and delighted him as he watched her come to meet him. In accordance with the wishes of her old-fashioned grandmother, her teeth were not blackened, but her eyebrows were delicately touched with stain. "Why, when I might be playing with a beautiful child, do I spend my time with an ugly woman?" Genji kept on asking himself in bewilderment while they sat together playing with her dolls. Next, she began to draw pictures and color them, after she had painted all sorts of queer and amusing things. "Now I'm going to do a picture for you," said Genji, and drawing a lady with very long hair, he put a dab of red on her nose. Even in a picture, he thought, pausing to look at the effect, it gave one a most uncomfortable feeling. He went and looked at himself in the mirror, and as though dissatisfied with his own fresh complexion, he suddenly put on his own nose a dab of red, such as he had given to the lady in the picture. He looked at himself in the mirror. His handsome face had in an instant become ridiculous and repulsive. At first the child laughed. "Should you go on liking me if I were always as ugly as this?" he asked. Suddenly, she began to be afraid that the paint would not come off. "Oh, why did you do it?" she cried. "How horrible!" He pretended to rub it without effect. "No," he said ruefully, "it will not come off. What a sad end to our game. I wonder what the emperor will say when I go back to the palace." He said it so seriously that she became very unhappy, and longing to cure him, dipped a piece of thick, soft paper in the water jug which stood by his writing things, and began scrubbing at his nose. "Take care," he cried, laughing, "that you do not serve me as Haiku was treated by his lady. I would rather have a red nose than a black one." So, they passed their time, making the prettiest couple. In the gentle spring sunshine, the trees were already shimmering with a haze of new-grown buds. Among them, It was the plum trees that gave the surest promise, for already their blossoms were uncurling, like lips parted in a faint smile. Earliest of them all was a red plum that grew beside the covered steps. It was in full color. Though fair the tree on which it blooms, this red flower fills me with a strange misgiving, sang Genji with a deep sigh. We shall see in the next chapter what happened in the end to all these people. The imperial visit to the Red Sparrow Court was to take place on the 10th day of the godless month. It was to be a more magnificent sight this year than it had ever been before, and the ladies of the palace were very disappointed that they could not be present. The emperor, too, could not bear that Fujitsubo should miss the spectacle, and he decided to hold a grand rehearsal in the palace. Prince Genji danced the waves of the blue sea. To no Chujo was his partner, but though both in skill and beauty, he far surpassed the common run of performers. Yet beside Genji, he seemed like a mountain fir growing beside a cherry tree in bloom. There was a wonderful moment when the rays of the setting sun fell upon him, and the music grew suddenly louder. Never had the onlookers seen feet tread so delicately, nor head so exquisitely poised. And in the song, which follows the first movement of the dance, his voice was sweet as that of Kalavinka, whose music is Buddha's law. So moving and beautiful was this dance that at the end of it, the emperor's eyes were wet, and all the princes and great gentlemen wept aloud. When the song was over, and straightening his long dancer's sleeves, he stood waiting for the music to begin again, and at last, the more lively tune of the second movement struck up. Then indeed, with his flushed and eager face, he merited more than ever his name of Genji, the Shining One. The Princess Kokiden did not at all like to see her stepson's beauty arousing so much enthusiasm, and she said sarcastically, "He is altogether too beautiful. Presently, we shall have a god coming down from the sky to fetch him away." Her young waiting ladies noticed the spiteful tone in which the remark was made, and felt somewhat embarrassed. As for Fujitsubo, she kept on telling herself that were it not for the guilty secret which was shared between them, the dance she was now witnessing would be filling her with wonder and delight. As it was, she sat as though in a dream, hardly knowing what went on around her. Now she was back in her own room. The emperor was with her. At today's rehearsal, he said, the waves of the blue sea went perfectly. Then, noticing that she made no response, "What did you think of it?" "Yes, it was very good," she managed to say at last. "The partner did not seem to me bad either," he went on. "There is always something about the way a gentleman moves and uses his hands, which distinguishes his dancing from that of professionals. Some of our crack dancing masters have certainly made very clever performers of their own children, but they never have the same freshness, the same charm as the young people of our class. They expended so much effort on the rehearsal that I am afraid the festival itself may seem a very poor affair. No doubt they took all this trouble because they knew that you were here at the rehearsal and would not see the real performance." Next morning, she received a letter from Genji. What of the rehearsal? How little the people who watched me knew of the turmoil that all the while was seething in my brain. And to this he added the poem, "When sick with love, I yet sprang to my feet and capered with the rest. Knew you what meant the fevered waving of my long dancing sleeve?" Next, he enjoined secrecy and prudence upon her. And so, his letter ended. Her answer showed that despite her agitation, she had not been wholly insensible to what had fascinated all other eyes. Though from far off a man of China waved his long, dancing sleeves, yet did his every motion fill my heart with wonder and delight. To receive such a letter from her was indeed a surprise. It charmed him that her knowledge should extend even to the court customs of a land beyond the sea. Already there was a regal note in her words. Yes, that was the end to which she was destined. Smiling to himself with pleasure, he spread the letter out before him, grasping it tightly in both hands as a priest holds the holy book, and gazed at it for a long while. On the day of the festival, the royal princes and all the great gentlemen of the court were in attendance. Even the heir apparent went with the procession. After the music boats had rowed round the lake, dance upon dance was performed, both Korean and of the land beyond the sea. The whole valley resounded with the noise of music and drums. The emperor insisted upon treating Genji's performance at the rehearsal as a kind of miracle or religious portent, and ordered special services to be read in every temple. Most people thought this step quite reasonable, but Princess Kokiden said crossly that she saw no necessity for it. The ring was by the emperor's order, composed indifferently of commoners and noblemen chosen out of the whole realm for their skill and grace. The two masters of ceremony, Sayamon no Kami and Uyemon no Kami, were in charge of the left and right wings of the orchestra. Dancing masters and others were entrusted with the task of seeking out performers of unusual merit and training them for the festival in their own houses. When at last, under the red leafage of tall autumn trees, 40 men stood circle-wise with their flutes, and to the music that they made a strong wind from the hills, sweeping the pine woods, added its fierce harmonies, while from amid a wreckage of whirling and scattered leaves, the dance of the blue waves suddenly broke out in all its glittering splendor. A rapture seized the onlookers that was akin to fear. The maple wreath that Genji wore had suffered in the wind, and thinking that the few red leaves which clung to it had a desolate air, the minister of the left plucked a bunch of chrysanthemums from among those that grew before the emperor's seat and twined them in the dancer's wreath. At sunset, the sky clouded over, and it looked like rain, but even the weather seemed conscious that such sights as this would not for a long while be seen again. Until all was over, not a drop fell. His exit dance, crowned as he was with this unspeakably beautiful wreath of many-colored flowers, was even more astonishing than that wonderful moment on the day of the rehearsal, and seemed to the thrilled onlookers like the vision of another world. Humble and ignorant folk, sitting afar on tree roots or beneath some rock, or half buried in deep banks of fallen leaves. Few were so hardened that they did not shed a tear. Next came the autumn wind, danced by Lady Yokyoden's son, who was still a mere child. The remaining performances attracted little attention, for the audience had had its fill of wonders, and felt that whatever followed could but spoil the recollection of what had gone before. That night, Genji was promoted to the first class of the third rank, and to no Chujo was promoted to intermediate, standing between the first and second classes of the fourth rank. The gentlemen of the court were all promoted one rank, but though they celebrated their good fortune with the usual rejoicings, they were well aware that they had only been dragged in Genji's wake, and wondered how it was that their destinies had come to be linked in this curious way with those of the prince who had brought them this unexpected piece of good fortune. Fujitsubo now retired to her own house, and Genji, waiting about for a chance of visiting her, was seldom at the great hall and was consequently in very ill odor there. It was soon after this that he brought the child Murasaki to live with him. Aoi heard a rumor of this, but it reached her merely in the form that someone was living with him at his palace, and she did not know that it was a child. Under these circumstances, it was quite natural that she should feel much aggrieved, but if only she had flown into an honest passion and abused him for it, as most people would have done, he would have told her everything and put matters right. As it was, she only redoubled her icy aloofness, and thus led him to seek those very distractions of which it was intended as a rebuke. Not only was her beauty so flawless that it could not fail to win his admiration, but also the mere fact that he had known her since so long ago, before all the rest, made him feel towards her a tenderness of which she seemed quite unaware. He was convinced, however, that her nature was not at bottom narrow and vindictive, and this gave him some hope that she would one day relent. Meanwhile, as he got to know little Murasaki better, he became the more content, both with her appearance and her character. She at least gave him her whole heart. For the present, he did not intend to reveal her identity even to the servants in his own palace. She continued to use the somewhat outlying western wing, which had now been put into excellent order, and here Genji constantly came to see her. He gave her all kinds of lessons, writing exercises for her to copy, and treating her in every way as though she were a little daughter who had been brought up by foster parents, but had now come to live with him. He chose her servants with great care, and gave orders that they should do everything in their power to make her comfortable. But no one except Koremitsu knew who the child was, or how she came to be living there, nor had her father discovered what had become of her. The little girl still sometimes thought of the past, and then she would feel for a while very lonely without her grandmother. When Genji was there, she forgot her sorrow, but in the evening, he was very seldom at home. She was sorry that he was so busy, and when he hurried every evening to some strange place or other, she missed him terribly, but she was never angry with him. Sometimes, for 2 or 3 days on end, he would be at the palace or the great hall, and when he returned, he would find her very tearful and depressed. Then he felt just as though he were neglecting some child of his own, whose mother had died, and left it in his keeping, and for a while he grew uneasy about his night excursions. The priest was puzzled when he heard that Genji had taken Murasaki to live with him, but saw no harm in it, and was delighted that she should be so well cared for. He was gratified, too, when Genji begged that the services in the dead nun's memory should be celebrated with special pomp and magnificence. When he went to Fujitsubo's palace, anxious to see for himself whether she was keeping her health, he was met by a posse of waiting women, Mayobas, Chunagons, Nakatsukasas, and the like, and Fujitsubo herself showed, to his great disappointment, no sign of appearing. They gave a good account of her, which somewhat allayed his anxiety, and had passed on to general gossip when it was announced that Prince Hyobukyo had arrived. Genji at once went out to speak to him. This time Genji thought him extremely handsome, and there was a softness, a caressing quality in his manner. Genji was watching him more closely than he knew, which was feminine enough to make his connection with Fujitsubo and Murasaki at once uppermost in the mind of his observer. It was then, as the brother of the one and the father of the other, that the newcomer at once created a feeling of intimacy, and they had a long conversation. Hyobukyo could not fail to notice that Genji was suddenly treating him with an affection which he had never displayed before. He was naturally very much gratified, not realizing that Genji had now, in a sense, become his son-in-law. It was getting late, and Hyobukyo was about to join his sister in another room. It was with bitterness that Genji remembered how long ago the emperor had brought her to play with him. In those days he ran in and out of her room just as he chose. Now, he could not address her, save in precarious messages. She was as inaccessible, as remote, as one person conceivably could be from another, and finding the situation intolerable, he said politely to Prince Hyobukyo, "I wish I saw you more often, unless there is some special reason for seeing people. I am lazy about it, but if you ever felt inclined to send for me, I should be delighted." And he hurried away. Omyobu, the gentlewoman who had contrived Genji's meeting with Fujitsubo, seeing her mistress relapse into a steady gloom, and vexed at her belated caution, was all the time doing her best to bring the lovers together again. But days and months went by, and still all her efforts were in vain, while they, poor souls, strove desperately to put away from them this love that was a perpetual disaster. At Genji's palace, Shonagon, the little girl's nurse, finding herself in a world of unimagined luxuries and amenities, could only attribute this good fortune to the success of the late nun's prayers. The Lord Buddha, to whose protection the dying lady had so fervently recommended her granddaughter, had indeed made handsome provision for her. There were, of course, certain disadvantages. The haughtiness of Aoi was not only in itself to be feared, but it seemed to have the consequence of driving Prince Genji to seek distractions right and left, which would be very unpleasant for the little princess so soon as she was old enough to realize it. Yet so strong a preference did he show for the child's company that Shonagon did not altogether lose heart. It being then 3 months since her grandmother died, Murasaki came out of mourning at the end of the godless month. But it was thought proper, since she was to be brought up as an orphan, that she should still avoid patterned stuffs, and she wore a little tunic of plain red, brown, or yellow, in which she nevertheless looked very smart and gay. He came to have a look at her before going off to the New Year's Day reception at court. "From today onwards, you are a grown-up lady," he said, and as he stood smiling at her, he looked so charming and friendly that she could not bear him to go, and hoping that he would stay and play with her a little while longer, she got out her toys. There was a doll's kitchen, only 3 feet high, but fitted out with all the proper utensils, and a whole collection of little houses which Genji had made for her. Now, she had got them all spread out over the floor so that it was difficult to move without treading on them. "Little Inu broke them yesterday," she explained, "when he was pretending to drive out the old year's demons, and I am mending them." She was evidently in great trouble. "What a tiresome child he is," said Genji. "I will get them mended for you. Come, you must not cry on New Year's Day." And he went out. Many of the servants had collected at the end of the corridor to see him starting out for the court in all his splendor. Murasaki too went out and watched him. When she came back, she put a grand dress on one of her dolls and did a performance with it, which she called Prince Genji Visiting the Emperor. "This year," said Shonagon, looking on with disapproval, "you must really try not to be such a baby. It is time little girls stopped playing with dolls when they are 10 years old. And now that you have got a kind gentleman wanting to be your husband, you ought to try and show him that. You can behave like a nice little grown-up lady, or he will get tired of waiting." She said this because she thought that it must be painful for Genji to see the child still so intent upon her games, and be thus reminded that she was a mere baby. Her admonishment had the effect of making Murasaki, for the first time, aware that Genji was to be her husband. She knew all about husbands. Many of the maidservants had them, but such ugly ones. She was very glad that hers was so much younger and handsomer. Nevertheless, the mere fact that she thought about the matter at all showed that she was beginning to grow up a little. Her childish ways and appearance were by no means so great a misfortune as Shonagon supposed, for they went a long way towards allaying the suspicions which the child's presence might otherwise have aroused in Genji's somewhat puzzled household. When he returned from court, he went straight to the great hall. Aoi was as perfect as ever and just as unfriendly. This never failed to wound Genji. If only you had changed with the new year, had become a little less cold and forbidding. How happy I should be, he exclaimed, but she had heard that someone was living with him and had at once made up her mind that she herself had been utterly supplanted and put aside. Hence she was more sullen than ever, but he pretended not to notice it, and by his gaiety and gentleness, at last induced her to answer when he spoke. Was it her being 4 years older than him that made her seem so unapproachable, so exasperatingly well-regulated? But that was not fair. What fault could he possibly find in her? She was perfect in every respect, and he realized that if she was sometimes out of humor, this was solely the result of his own irregularities. She was, after all, the daughter of a minister, and of the minister who above all others enjoyed the greatest influence and esteem. She was the only child of the emperor's sister, and had been brought up with a full sense of her own dignity and importance. The least slight, the merest hint of disrespect, came to her as a complete surprise. To Genji, all these pretensions naturally seemed somewhat exaggerated, and his failure to make allowances for them increased her hostility. Aoi's father was vexed by Genji's seeming fickleness, but so soon as he was with him, he forgot all his grievances and was always extremely nice to him. When Genji was leaving next day, his father-in-law came to his room and helped him to dress, bringing in his own hands a belt, which was an heirloom famous far and wide. He pulled straight the back of Genji's robe, which had become a little crumpled, and indeed, short of bringing him his shoes, performed in the friendliest way every possible small service. "This," said Genji, handing back the belt, "is for imperial banquets or other great occasions of that kind. I have others much more valuable," said the minister, "which I will give you for the imperial banquets. This one is not of much account, save that the workmanship of it is rather unusual." And despite Genji's protests, he insisted upon buckling it round him. The performance of such services was his principal interest in life. What did it matter if Genji was rather irregular in his visits? To have so agreeable a young man going in and out of one's house at all was the greatest pleasure he could imagine. Genji did not pay many New Year's visits. First he went to the emperor, then the heir apparent and the ex-emperor, and after that to Princess Fujitsubo's house in the 3rd ward. As they saw him enter, the servants of the house noticed how much he had grown and altered in the last year. "Look how he has filled out," they said, "even since his last visit." Of the princess herself, he was only allowed a distant glimpse. It gave him many forebodings. Her child had been expected in the 12th month, and her condition was now causing some anxiety, that it would at any rate be born sometime during the first weeks of the new year was confidently assumed by her own people and had been stated at court. But the first month went by, and still nothing happened. It began to be rumored that she was suffering from some kind of possession or delusion. She herself grew very depressed. She felt certain that when the event at last happened, she would not survive it, and she worried so much about herself that she became seriously ill. The delay made Genji more certain than ever of his own responsibility, and he arranged secretly for prayers on her behalf to be said in all the great temples. He had already become firmly convinced that whatever might happen concerning the child Fujitsubo was herself utterly doomed when he heard that about the 10th day of the second month she had successfully given birth to a boy. The news brought great satisfaction both to the emperor and the whole court. The emperor's fervent prayers for her life and for that of a child which she knew was not his distressed and embarrassed her, whereas when the maliciously gloomy prognostications of Kokiden and the rest were brought to her notice, she was at once filled with a perverse desire to disappoint their hopes and make them look ridiculous in the eyes of those to whom they had confided their forebodings. By a great effort of will, she threw off the despair which had been weighing down upon her and began little by little to recover her usual vigor. The emperor was impatient to see Fujitsubo's child, and so too, though he was forced to conceal his interest in the matter, was Genji himself. Accordingly, he went to her palace when there were not many people about, and sent in a note offering, as the emperor was in such a state of impatience to see the child, and etiquette forbade him to do so for several weeks, to look at the child himself and report upon its appearance to the emperor. She replied that she would rather he saw it on a day when it was less peevish, but in reality her refusal had nothing to do with the state of the child's temper. She could not bear the idea of his seeing it at all. Already it bore an astonishing resemblance to him. Of that she was convinced. Always there lurked in her heart the torturing demon of fear. Soon others would see the child, and instantly know with absolute certainty the secret of her swift transgression. What charity towards such a crime as this would a world have that gossips if a single hair is awry? Such thoughts continually tormented her, and she again became weary of her life. From time to time he saw Omyobu, but though he still implored her to arrange a meeting, none of his many arguments availed him. He also pestered her with so many questions about the child that she exclaimed at last, "Why, you go on plaguing me like this? You will be seeing him for yourself soon, when he is shown at court." But though she spoke impatiently, she knew quite well what he was suffering, and felt for him deeply. The matter was not one which he could discuss, except with Fujitsubo herself, and it was impossible to see her. Would he indeed ever again see her alone, or communicate with her, save through notes and messengers? And half weeping with despair, he recited the verse, "What guilty intercourse must ours have been in some life long ago, that now so cruel a barrier should be set between us?" Omyobu, seeing that it cost her mistress a great struggle to do without him, was at pains not to dismiss him too unkindly, and answered with the verse, "Should you see the child, my lady would be in torment, and because you have not seen it, you are full of lamentations. Truly have children been called a black darkness that leads the parent's heart astray." And coming closer, she whispered to him, Poor souls, it is a hard fate that has overtaken you both. Thus, many times and again, he returned to his house, desperate. Fujitsubo, meanwhile, fearing lest Genji's continual visits should attract notice, began to suspect that Omyobu was secretly encouraging him, and no longer felt the same affection for her. She did not want this to be noticed, and tried to treat her just as usual, but her irritation was bound sometimes to betray itself, and Omyobu, feeling that her mistress was estranged from her, and at a loss to find any reason for it, was very miserable. It was not till its 4th month that the child was brought to the palace. It was large for its age, and had already begun to take a great interest in what went on around it. Its extraordinary resemblance to Genji was not remarked upon by the emperor, who had an idea that handsome children were all very much alike at that age. He became intensely devoted to the child, and lavished every kind of care and attention upon it. For Genji himself, he had always had so great a partiality that, had it not been for popular opposition, he would certainly have installed him as heir apparent. That he had not been able to do so constantly distressed him. To have produced so magnificent a son, and be obliged to watch him growing up a mere nobleman, had always been galling to him. Now, in his old age, a son had been born to him who promised to be equally handsome, and had not the tiresome disadvantage of a plebeian mother. And upon this flawless pearl he expended his whole affection. The mother saw little chance of this rapture continuing, and was all this while in a state of agonized apprehension. One day, when, as he had been wont to do before, Genji was making music for her at the emperor's command, His Majesty took the child in his arms, saying to Genji, "I have had many children, but you were the only other one that I ever behaved about in this fashion. It may be my fancy, but it seems to me this child is exactly like what you were at the same age. However, I suppose all babies are very much alike, while they are as small as this." And he looked at the fine child with admiration. A succession of violent emotions, terror, shame, pride, and love, passed through Genji's breast while these words were being spoken, and were reflected in his rapidly changing color. He was almost in tears. The child looked so exquisitely beautiful as it lay crowing to itself and smiling that, hideous as the situation was, Genji could not help feeling glad it was thought to be like him. Fujitsubo, meanwhile, was in a state of embarrassment and agitation so painful that a cold sweat broke out upon her while she sat by. For Genji, this jarring of opposite emotions was too much to be borne, and he went home. Here he lay, tossing on his bed, and unable to distract himself. He determined after a while to go to the great hall. As he passed by the flower beds in front of his house, he noticed that a faint tinge of green was already filming the bushes, and under them the tokonatsu were already in bloom. He plucked one and sent it to Omyobu with a long letter and an acrostic poem in which he said that he was touched by the likeness of this flower to the child, but also hinted that he was perturbed by the child's likeness to himself. "In this flower," he continued despondently, "I had hoped to see your beauty enshrined, but now I know that being mine, yet not mine, it can bring me no comfort to look upon it." After waiting a little while till a favorable moment should arise, Omyobu showed her mistress the letter, saying with a sigh, "I fear that your answer will be but dust to the petals of this thirsting flower. but Fujitsubo, in whose heart also the new spring was awakening a host of tender thoughts, wrote in answer the poem, "Though it alone be the cause that these poor sleeves are wet with dew, yet goes my heart still with it, this child flower of Yamato land." This was all, and it was roughly scribbled in a faint hand, but it was a comfort to Omyobu to have even such a message as this to bring back. Genji knew quite well that it could lead to nothing. How many times had she sent him such messages before? Yet, as he lay dejectedly gazing at the note, the mere sight of her handwriting soon stirred in him a frenzy of unreasoning excitement and delight. For a while he lay restlessly tossing on his bed. At last, unable to remain any longer inactive, he sprang up and went, as he had so often done before, to the western wing to seek distraction from the agitated thoughts which pursued him. He came towards the women's apartments, with his hair loose upon his shoulders, wearing a queer dressing gown, and, in order to amuse Murasaki, playing a tune on his flute. As he walked, he peeped in at the door. She looked as she lay there for all the world like the fresh dewy flower that he had so recently plucked. She was growing a little bit spoiled, and having heard some while ago that he had returned from court, she was rather cross with him for not coming to see her at once. She did not run to meet him, as she usually did, but lay with her head turned away. He called to her from the far side of the room to get up and come to him, but she did not stir. Suddenly, he heard that she was murmuring to herself the lines, "Like a sea flower that the waters have covered when a great tide mounts the shore." They were from an old poem that he had taught her, in which a lady complains that she is neglected by her lover. She looked bewitching as she lay with her face half sullenly, half coquettishly buried in her sleeve. "How naughty!" he cried. "Really, you are becoming too witty. But if you saw me more often, perhaps you would grow tired of me." Then he sent for his zithern and asked her to play to him. But it was a big Chinese instrument with 13 strings. The 5 slender strings in the middle embarrassed her, and she could not get the full sound out of them. Taking it from her, he shifted the bridge, and tuning it to a lower pitch, played a few chords upon it, and bade her try again. Her sullen mood was over. She began to play very prettily. Sometimes, when there was a gap too long for one small hand to stretch, helping herself out so adroitly with the other hand that Genji was completely captivated, and taking up his flute, taught her a number of new tunes. She was very quick and grasped the most complicated rhythms at a single hearing. She had indeed, in music, as in all else, just those talents with which it most delighted him that she should be endowed. When he played the Hosoroguseri, which in spite of its absurd name is an excellent tune, she accompanied him, though with a childish touch, yet in perfect time. The great lamp was brought in, and they began looking at pictures together. But Genji was going out that night. Already, his attendants were assembled in the courtyard outside. One of them was saying that a storm was coming on. He ought not to wait any longer. Again, Murasaki was unhappy. She was not looking at the pictures, but sat with her head on her hands, staring despondently at the floor. Stroking the lovely hair that had fallen forward across her lap, Genji asked her if she missed him when he was away. She nodded. "I am just the same," he said. "If I miss seeing you for a single day, I am terribly unhappy. But you are only a little girl, and I know that whatever I do, you will not think harsh thoughts about me, while the lady that I go to see is very jealous and angry, so that it would break her heart if I were to stay with you too long. But I do not at all like being there, and that is why I just go for a little while like this, When you are grown up, of course, I shall never go away at all. I only go now because if I did not, she would be so terribly angry with me that I might very likely die, and then there would be no one to love you and take care of you at all. He had told her all he could, but still she was offended and would not answer a word. At last, he took her on his knee, and here, to his great embarrassment, she fell asleep. It is too late to go out now, he said after a while, turning to the gentlewomen who were in attendance. They rose and went to fetch his supper. He roused the child. Look, he said, I did not go out after all. She was happy once more, and they went to supper together. She liked the queer, irregular meal. But when it was over, she began again to watch him uneasily. If you are really not going out, she said, why do you not go to sleep at once? Leaving her at such a moment to go back to his room, he felt all the reluctance of one who is setting out upon a long and perilous journey. It constantly happened that at the last minute, he thus decided to stay with her. It was natural that some report of his new preoccupation should leak out into the world and be passed on to the great hall. Who can it be? Said one of Aoi's ladies. It is really the most inexplicable business. How can he have suddenly become entirely wrapped up in someone whom we had never heard the existence of before? It cannot in any case be a person of much breeding or self-respect. It is probably some girl employed at the palace, whom he has taken to live with him in order that the affair may be hushed up. No doubt, he is circulating the story that she is a child, merely in order to put us off the scent. And this opinion was shared by the rest. The emperor, too, had heard that there was someone living with Genji and thought it a great pity. You are treating the minister very badly, he said. He has shown the greatest possible devotion to you ever since you were a mere baby. And now that you are old enough to know better, you behave like this towards him and his family. It is really most ungrateful. Genji listened respectfully, but made no reply. The emperor began to fear that his marriage with Aoi had proved a very unhappy one, and was sorry that he had arranged it. I do not understand you, he said. You seem to have no taste for gallantry, and do not, so far as I can see, take the slightest interest in any of the ladies in waiting whom one might expect you to find attractive, nor do you bother yourself about the various beauties who in one part of the town or another are now in request, but instead you must needs pick up some creature from no one knows where and wound the feelings of others by keeping her as your mistress. Though he was now getting on in years, the emperor had himself by no means ceased to be interested in such matters. He had always seen to it that his ladies-in-waiting and palace servants should be remarkable, both for their looks and their intelligence, and it was a time when the court was full of interesting women. There were few among them whom Genji could not, by the slightest word or gesture, have made his own, but, perhaps because he saw too much of them, he did not find them in the least attractive. Suspecting this, they would occasionally experiment upon him with some frivolous remark. He answered so staidly that they saw a flirtation would be impossible, and some of them came to the conclusion that he was rather a dull, prudish young man. There was an elderly lady of the bedchamber who, though she was an excellent creature in every other way, and was very much liked and respected, was an outrageous flirt. It astonished Genji that despite her advancing years, she showed no sign of reforming her reckless and fantastic behavior. Curious to see how she would take it, he one day came up and began joking with her. She appeared to be quite unconscious of the disparity between their ages and at once counted him as an admirer. Slightly alarmed, he nevertheless found her company rather agreeable and often talked with her, but chiefly because he was frightened of being laughed at if anyone found out, he refused to become her lover, and this she very much resented. One day, she was dressing the emperor's hair. When this was over, His Majesty sent for his valets and went with them into another room. Genji and the elderly lady were left alone together. She was fuller than ever of languishing airs and poses, and her costume was to the last degree stylish and elaborate. Poor creature, he thought, how little difference it all makes. And he was passing her on his way out of the room when suddenly the temptation to give a tug at her dress became irresistible. She glanced swiftly round, eyeing him above the rim of a marvelously painted summer fan. The eyelids beneath which she ogled at him were blackened and sunken. Wisps of hair projected untidily around her forehead. There was something singularly inappropriate about this gaudy, coquettish fan. Handing her his own, instead, he took it from her and examined it. On paper, coated with a red so thick and lustrous that you could see yourself reflected in it, a forest of tall trees was painted in gold. At the side of this design, in a hand which, though out of date, was not lacking in distinction, was written the poem about the forest of Oraki. He made no doubt that the owner of the fan had written it in allusion to her own advancing years, and was expecting him to make a gallant reply. Turning over in his mind how best to divert the extravagant ardor of this strange creature, he could, to his own amusement, think only of another poem about the same forest, but to this it would have been ill-bred to allude. He was feeling very uncomfortable, lest someone should come in and see them together. She, however, was quite at her ease, and seeing that he remained silent, she recited with many arch looks the poem, "Come to me in the forest, and I will cut pasture for your horse, though it be but of the underleaf whose season is past. Should I seek your woodland," he answered, "my fair name would be gone, for down its glades at all times the pattering of hoofs is heard." And he tried to get away, but she held him back, saying, "How odious you are! That is not what I mean at all. No one has ever insulted me like this before." And she burst into tears. "Let us talk about it some other time," said Genji. "I did not mean—" And freeing himself from her grasp, he rushed out of the room, leaving her in great dudgeon. She felt indeed, after his repulse, prodigiously old and tottering. All this was seen by His Majesty, who, his toilet long ago completed, had watched the ill-assorted pair with great amusement from behind his imperial screen. "I am always being told," he said, "that the boy takes no interest in the members of my household, but I cannot say that he seems to me unduly shy." And he laughed. For a moment she was slightly embarrassed, but she felt that any relationship with Genji, even if it consisted of being rebuffed by him in public, was distinctly a feather in her cap, and she made no attempt to defend herself against the emperor's raillery. The story soon went the round of the court. It astonished no one more than to No Chujo, who, though he knew that Genji was given to odd experiments, could not believe that his friend was really launched upon the fantastic courtship which rumor was attributing to him. There seemed no better way of discovering whether it was conceivably possible to regard the lady in such a light than to make love to her himself. The attentions of so distinguished a suitor went a long way towards consoling her for her late discomfiture. Her new intrigue was of course carried on with absolute secrecy, and Genji knew nothing about it. When he next met her, she seemed to be very cross with him, and feeling sorry for her because she was so old, he made up his mind that he must try to console her. But for a long while, he was completely occupied by tiresome business of one kind and another. At last, one very dismal, rainy evening, when he was strolling in the neighborhood of the Umaiden, he heard this lady playing most agreeably on her lute. She was so good a performer that she was often called upon to play with the professional male musicians in the imperial orchestra. It happened that at this moment she was somewhat downcast and discontented, and in such a mood she played with even greater feeling and verve. She was singing the melon grower's song admirably, he thought, despite its inappropriateness to her age. So must the voice of the mysterious lady at Ochu have sounded in Po Chui's ears when he heard her singing on her boat at night, and he stood listening. At the end of the song, the player sighed heavily, as though quite worn out by the passionate vehemence of her serenade. Genji approached softly, humming the Azumaya. Here in the portico of the eastern house, rain splashes on me while I wait. Come, my beloved, open the door and let me in. Immediately, indeed, with an unseemly haste, she answered as does the lady in the song, open the door and come in, adding the verse, in the wide shelter of that portico, no man yet was ever splashed with rain. And again she sighed so portentously that although he did not at all suppose that he alone was the cause of this demonstration, he felt it in any case to be somewhat exaggerated and answered with the poem, your sighs show clearly that, despite the song, you are another's bride, and I, for my part, have no mind to haunt the loggias of your eastern house. He would gladly have passed on, but he felt that this would be too unkind, and seeing that someone else was coming towards her room, he stepped inside and began talking lightly of indifferent subjects, in a style which, though it was in reality somewhat forced, she found very entertaining. It was intolerable, thought Tu no Chujo, that Genji should be praised as a quiet and serious young man, and should constantly rebuke him for his frivolity, while all the time he was carrying on a multiplicity of interesting intrigues, which out of mere churlishness he kept entirely hidden from all his friends. For a long while, Chujo had been waiting for an opportunity to expose this sanctimonious imposture, and when he saw Genji enter the gentlewoman's apartment, you may be sure he was delighted. To scare him a little at such a moment would be an excellent way to punish him for his unfriendliness. He slackened his pace and watched. The wind sighed in the trees. It was getting very late. Surely Genji would soon begin to doze, and indeed he did now look as though he had fallen asleep. Chujo stole on tiptoe into the room, but Genji, who was only half dreaming, instantly heard him, and not knowing that Chujo had followed him, got it into his head that it was a certain commissioner of works who years ago had been supposed to be an admirer of the lady. The idea of being discovered in such a situation by this important old gentleman filled him with horror, furious with his companion for having exposed him to the chance of such a predicament. This is too bad, he whispered. I am going home. What possessed you to let me in on a night when you knew that someone else was coming? He had only time to snatch up his cloak and hide behind a long folding screen before Chujo entered the room, and going straight up to the screen, began in a businesslike manner to fold it up. Though she was no longer young, the lady did not lose her head in this alarming crisis. Being a woman of fashion, she had on more than one occasion found herself in an equally agitating position. And now, despite her astonishment, after considering for a moment what had best be done with the intruder, she seized him by the back of his coat, and with a practiced, though trembling hand, pulled him away from the screen. Genji had still no idea that it was Chujo. He had half a mind to show himself, but quickly remembered that he was oddly and inadequately clad, with his headdress all awry. He felt that if he ran for it, he would cut much too strange a figure as he left the room, and for a moment he hesitated, wondering how much longer Genji would take to recognize him. Chujo did not say a word, but putting on the most ferocious air imaginable, drew his sword from the scabbard, whereupon the lady, crying, "Gentlemen, gentlemen," flung herself between them in an attitude of romantic supplication. They could hardly refrain from bursting into laughter. It was only by day, when very carefully painted and bedizened, that she still retained a certain superficial air of youth and charm. But now this woman of 57 or 8, disturbed by a sudden brawl in the midst of her amours, created the most astonishing spectacle, as she knelt at the feet of two young men in their teens, beseeching them not to die for her. Chujo, however, refrained from showing the slightest sign of amusement, and continued to look as alarming and ferocious as he could. But he was now in full view, and Genji realized in a moment that Chujo had all the while known who he was, and had been amusing himself at his expense. Much relieved at this discovery, he grabbed at the scabbard from which Chujo had drawn the sword, and held it fast, lest his friend should attempt to escape, and then, despite his annoyance at having been followed, burst into an uncontrollable fit of laughter. "Are you in your right mind?" said Genji at last. "This is really a very poor sort of joke. Do you mind letting me get into my cloak?" Whereupon Chujo snatched the cloak from him, and would not give it back. "Very well then," said Genji. "If you are to have my cloak, I must have yours." And so saying, he pulled open the clasp of Chujo's belt, and began tugging his cloak from his shoulders. Chujo resisted, and a long tussle followed, in which the cloak was torn to shreds. "Should you now get it in exchange for yours, this tattered cloak will but reveal the secrets it is meant to hide," recited to no Chujo. To which Genji replied with an acrostic poem, in which he complained that Chujo, with whom he shared so many secrets, should have thought it necessary to spy upon him in this fashion. But neither was really angry with the other, and setting their disordered costumes to rights, they both took their departure. Genji discovered, when he was alone, that it had indeed upset him very much to find his movements had been watched, and he could not sleep. The lady felt utterly bewildered. On the floor she found a belt and a buckle, which she sent to Genji next day, with a complicated acrostic poem in which she compared these stranded properties to the weeds which, after their straining and tugging the waves leave upon the shore. She added an allusion to the crystal river of her tears. He was irritated by her persistency, but distressed at the shock to which she had been subjected by Chujo's foolish joke, and he answered with the poem, "At the antics of the prancing wave, you have good cause to be angry, but blameless indeed is the shore on whose sands it lashed." The belt was Chujo's. That was plain, for it was darker in color than his own cloak, and as he examined his cloak, he noticed that the lower half of one sleeve was torn away. What a mess everything was in! He told himself with disgust that he was becoming a rowdy, a vulgar night brawler. Such people, he knew, were always tearing their clothes and making themselves ridiculous. It was time to reform. The missing sleeve soon arrived from Chujo's apartments, with the message, "Had you not better have this sewn on before you wear your cloak?" How had he managed to get hold of it? Such tricks were very tiresome and silly, but he supposed he must now give back the belt, and wrapping it in paper of the same color, he sent it with a riddling poem in which he said that he would not keep it, lest he should make trouble between Chujo and the lady. You have dragged her away from me, as in the scuffle you snatched from me this belt, said Chujo in his answering poem, and added, Have I not good reason to be angry with you? Later in the morning, they met in the presence room. Genji wore a solemn and abstracted air. Chujo could not help recollecting the absurd scene of their last meeting. But it was a day upon which there was a great deal of public business to dispatch, and he was soon absorbed in his duties. But from time to time, each would catch sight of the other's serious face and heavy official bearing, and then they could not help smiling. In an interval, Chujo came up to Genji and asked him in a low voice whether he had decided in future to be a little more communicative about his affairs. No, indeed, said Genji, but I feel I owe you an apology for preventing you from spending a happy hour with the lady whom you had come to visit. Everything in life seems to go wrong. So they whispered, and at the end, each solemnly promised the other not to speak of the matter to anybody. But to the two of them, it furnished a constant supply of jokes for a long while to come, though Genji took the matter to heart more than he showed, and was determined never to get mixed up with such a tiresome creature again. He heard, however, that the lady was still much ruffled, and fearing that there might be no one at hand to comfort her, he had not the heart quite to discontinue his visits. Chujo, faithful to his promise, did not mention the affair to anyone, not even to his sister, but kept it as a weapon of self-defense should Genji ever preach high morality to him again. Such marked preference did the emperor show in his treatment of Genji that even the other princes of the blood royal stood somewhat in awe of him. But no Chujo was ready to dispute with him on any subject, and was by no means inclined always to let him have his own way. He and Aoi were the only children of the emperor's sister. Genji, it is true, was the emperor's son, but though Chujo's father was only a minister, his influence was far greater than that of his colleagues, and as the son of such a man, by his marriage with a royal princess, he was used to being treated with the greatest deference. It had never so much as occurred to him that he was in any way Genji's inferior, for he knew that as regards his person, at least he had no reason to be dissatisfied, and with most other qualities, whether of character or intelligence, he believed himself to be very adequately endowed. Thus, a friendly rivalry grew up between the two of them and led to many diverting incidents which it would take too long to describe. In the 7th month, 2 events of importance took place. An empress was appointed, and Genji was raised to the rank of counselor. The emperor was intending very soon to resign the throne. He would have liked to proclaim his newborn child as heir apparent in place of Kokiden's son. This was difficult, for there was no political function which would have supported such a choice. Fujitsubo's relations were all members of the imperial family, and Genji, to whom he might have looked for help, owing to his affiliation with the Minamoto clan, unfortunately showed no aptitude for political intrigue. The best he could do was at any rate to strengthen Fujitsubo's position and hope that later on she would be able to exert her influence. Kokiden heard of his intentions, and small wonder if she was distressed and astounded. The emperor tried to quiet her by pointing out that in a short time her son would succeed to the throne, and that she would then hold the equally important rank of Empress Mother. But it was indeed hard that the mother of the heir apparent should be passed over in favor of a concubine aged little more than 20. The public tended to take Kokidin's side, and there was a good deal of discontent. On the night when the new empress was installed, Genji, as a counselor, was among those who accompanied her to the Middle Palace as daughter of a previous empress and mother of an exquisite prince. She enjoyed a consideration at court beyond that which her new rank would have alone procured for her. But if it was with admiring devotion that the other great lords of her train attended her that day, it may be imagined with what fond yet agonized thoughts Prince Genji followed the litter in which she rode. She seemed, at last, to have been raised so far beyond his reach that, scarce knowing what he did, he murmured to himself the lines, "Now, upon love's dark path, has the last shadow closed, for I have seen you carried to a cloudland whither none may climb." As the days and months went by, the child grew more and more like Genji. The new empress was greatly distressed, but no one else seemed to notice the resemblance. He was not, of course, so handsome. How indeed should he have been? But both were beautiful, and the world was content to accept their beauty without troubling to compare them, just as it accepts both moon and sun as lovely occupants of the sky. About the 20th day of the second month, the emperor gave a Chinese banquet under the great cherry tree of the southern court. Both Fujitsubo and the heir apparent were to be there. Kokiden, although she knew that the mere presence of the empress was sufficient to spoil her pleasure, could not bring herself to forego so delightful an entertainment. After some promise of rain, the day turned out magnificent, and in full sunshine, with the birds singing in every tree. The guests, royal princes, noblemen, and professional poets alike, were handed the rhyme words which the emperor had drawn by lot, and set to work to compose their poems. It was with a clear and ringing voice that Genji read out the word spring, which he had received as the rhyme sound of his poem. Next came To no Chujo, who, feeling that all eyes were upon him, and determined to impress himself favorably on his audience, moved with the greatest possible elegance and grace, and when on receiving his rhyme, he announced his name, rank, and titles, he took great pains to speak pleasantly, as well as audibly. Many of the other gentlemen were rather nervous, and looked quite pale as they came forward, yet they acquitted themselves well enough. But the professional poets, particularly owing to the high standard of accomplishment which the emperor's and heir apparent's lively interest in Chinese poetry had at that time diffused through the court, were very ill at ease. As they crossed the long space of the garden on their way to receive their rhymes, they felt utterly helpless. A simple Chinese verse is surely not much to ask of a professional poet, but they all wore an expression of the deepest gloom. One expects elderly scholars to be somewhat odd in their movements and behavior, and it was amusing to see the lively concern with which the emperor watched their various, but always uncouth and erratic methods of approaching the throne. Needless to say, a great deal of music had been arranged for. Towards dusk, the delightful dance known as the warbling of spring nightingales was performed, and when it was over, the heir apparent, remembering the festival of red leaves, placed a wreath on Genji's head, and pressed him so urgently that it was impossible for him to refuse. Rising to his feet, he danced very quietly a fragment of the sleeve-turning passage in the wave dance. In a few moments, he was seated again, but even into this brief extract from a long dance, he managed to import an unrivaled charm and grace. Even his father-in-law, who was not in the best of humor with him, was deeply moved and found himself wiping away a tear. "And why have we not seen Tu no Chujo?" said the heir apparent, whereupon Chujo danced the park of willow flowers, giving a far more complete performance than Genji, for no doubt he knew that he would be called upon and had taken trouble to prepare his dance. It was a great success, and the emperor presented him with a cloak, which everyone said was a most unusual honor. After this, the other young noblemen who were present danced in no particular order, but it was now so dark that it was impossible to discriminate between their performances. Then the poems were opened and read aloud. The reading of Genji's verses was continually interrupted by loud murmurs of applause. Even the professional poets were deeply impressed, and it may well be imagined what pride the emperor, to whom at times Genji was a source of consolation and delight, watched him upon such an occasion as this. Fujitsubo, when she allowed herself to glance in his direction, marveled that even Kokiden could find it in her heart to hate him. "It is because he is fond of me. There can be no other reason," she decided at last, and the verse, "Were I but a common mortal, who now am gazing at the beauty of this flower, from its sweet petals not long should I withhold the dew of love," framed itself on her lips, though she dared not utter it aloud. It was now very late, and the banquet was over. The guests had scattered. The empress and the heir apparent had both returned to the palace. All was still. The moon had risen very bright and clear, and Genji, heated with wine, could not bear to quit so lovely a scene. The people at the palace were probably all plunged in a heavy sleep. On such a night, it was not impossible that some careless person might have left some door unfastened, some shutter unbarred. Cautiously and stealthily, he crept towards Fujitsubo's apartments and inspected them. Every bolt was fast. He sighed. Here there was evidently nothing to be done. He was passing the loggia of Kokiden's palace when he noticed that the shutters of the third arch were not drawn. After the banquet, Kokiden herself had gone straight to the emperor's rooms. There did not seem to be anyone about. A door leading from the loggia into the house was standing open, but he could hear no sound within. It is under just such circumstances as this that one is apt to drift into compromising situations, thought Genji. Nevertheless, he climbed quietly onto the balustrade and peeped. Everyone must be asleep, but no. A very agreeable young voice, with an intonation which was certainly not that of any waiting woman or common person, was softly humming the last two lines of the Oborozuki Yo. Was not the voice coming towards him? It seemed so, and stretching out his hand, he suddenly found that he was grasping a lady's sleeve. "Oh, how you frightened me!" she cried. "Who is it?" "Do not be alarmed," he whispered. "That both of us were not content to miss the beauty of this departing night is proof more clear than the half-clouded moon that we were meant to meet." And as he recited the words, he took her gently by the hand and led her into the house, closing the door behind them. Her surprised and puzzled air fascinated him. "There is someone there," she whispered tremulously, pointing to the inner room. "Child," he answered, "I am allowed to go wherever I please, and if you send for your friends, they will only tell you that I have every right to be here. But if you will stay quietly here—" It was Genji. She knew his voice, and the discovery somewhat reassured her. She thought his conduct rather strange, but she was determined that he should not think her prudish or stiff. And so, because he on his side was still somewhat excited after the doings of the evening, while she was far too young and pliant to offer any serious resistance, he soon got his own way with her. Suddenly, they saw to their discomfiture that dawn was creeping into the sky. She looked, thought Genji, as though many disquieting reflections were crowding into her mind. "Tell me your name," he said. "How can I write to you unless you do? Surely this is not going to be our only meeting." She answered with a poem in which she said that names are of this world only, and he would not care to know hers if he were resolved that their love should last till worlds to come. It was a mere quip, and Genji, amused at her quickness, answered, "You are quite right. It was a mistake on my part to ask." And he recited the poem, "While still I seek to find on which blade dwells the dew, a great wind shakes the grasses of the level land. If you did not repent of this meeting," he continued, "you would surely tell me who you are. I do not believe that you want." But here he was, interrupted by the noise of people stirring in the next room. There was a great bustle, and it was clear that they would soon be starting out to fetch Princess Kokiden back from the palace. There was just time to exchange fans in token of their new friendship before Genji was forced to fly precipitately from the room. In his own apartments, he found many of his gentlemen waiting for him. Some were awake, and these nudged one another when he entered the room, as though to say, "Will he never cease these disreputable excursions?" But discretion forbade them to show that they had seen him, and they all pretended to be fast asleep. Genji too lay down, but he could not rest. He tried to recall the features of the lady with whom he had just spent so agreeable a time. Certainly, she must be one of Kokiden's sisters, perhaps the fifth or sixth daughter, both of whom were still unmarried. The handsomest of them, or so he had always heard, were Prince Sochi's wife and the fourth daughter, the one with whom to know Chujo got on so badly. It would really be rather amusing if it did turn out to be Chujo's wife. The sixth was shortly to be married to the heir apparent. How tiresome if it were she, but at present he could think of no way to make sure. She had not behaved at all, as though she did not want to see him again. Why then had she refused to give him any chance of communicating with her? In fact, he worried about the matter so much, and turned it over in his mind with such endless persistency, that it soon became evident he had fallen deeply in love with her. Nevertheless, no sooner did the recollection of Fujitsubo's serious and reticent demeanor come back to his mind than he realized how incomparably more she meant to him than this light-hearted lady. That day, the after-banquet kept him occupied till late at night. At the emperor's command, he performed on the 13-stringed zithern, and had an even greater success than with his dancing on the day before. At dawn, Fujitsubo retired to the emperor's rooms, disappointed in his hope that the lady of last night would somewhere or somehow make her appearance on the scene. He sent for Yoshikyo and Koremitsu, with whom all his secrets were shared, and bade them keep watch upon the lady's family. When he returned next day from duty at the palace, they reported that they had just witnessed the departure of several coaches which had been drawn up under shelter in the courtyard of the watch, among a group of persons who seemed to be the domestic attendants of those for whom the coaches were waiting. 2 gentlemen came threading their way in a great hurry. These we recognized as Shi no Shosho and Uchubin. So there is little doubt that the carriages belonged to Princess Kokiden. For the rest, we noted that the ladies were by no means ill-looking, and that the whole party drove away in 3 carriages. Genji's heart beat fast. but he was no nearer than before to finding out which of the sisters it had been. Supposing her father, the minister of the right, should hear anything of this, what a to-do there would be. It would indeed mean his absolute ruin. It was a pity that while he was about it, he did not stay with her till it was a little lighter. But there it was. He did not know her face, but yet he was determined to recognize her. How? He lay on his bed, devising and rejecting endless schemes. Murasaki, too, must be growing impatient. Days had passed since he had visited her, and he remembered with tenderness how low-spirited she became when he was not able to be with her. But in a moment, his thoughts had returned to the unknown lady. He still had her fan. It was a folding fan, with ribs of hinoki wood and tassels tied in a splice knot. One side was covered with silver leaf, on which was painted a dim moon, giving the impression of a moon reflected in water. It was a device which he had seen many times before, but it had agreeable associations for him, and continuing the metaphor of the grass on the moor, which she had used in her poem, he wrote on the fan, "Has mortal man ever puzzled his head with such a question before as to ask where the moon goes to when she leaves the sky at dawn?" And he put the fan safely away. It was on his conscience that he had not for a long while been to the great hall, but fearing that Murasaki, too, might be feeling very unhappy, he first went home to give her her lessons. Every day, she was improving not only in looks, but also in amiability of character. The beauty of her disposition was indeed quite out of the common. The idea that so perfect a nature was in his hands, to train and cultivate as he thought best, was very attractive to Genji. It might, however, have been objected that to receive all her education from a young man is likely to make a girl somewhat forward in her manner. First, there was a great deal to tell her about what had happened at the court entertainments of the last few days. Then followed her music lesson, and already it was time to go. Oh, why must he always go away so soon? She wondered sadly, but by now she was so used to it that she no longer fretted as she had done a little while ago. At the great hall he could, as usual, scarcely get a word out of Aoi. The moment that he sat idle, 1,000 doubts and puzzles began to revolve in his mind. He took up his zithern and began to sing. Not softlier. Pillowed is my head that rests by thine, unloving bride. Then were those jagged stones, my bed through which the falls of Nuki stride. At this moment, Aoi's father came by and began to discuss the unusual success of the recent festivities. Old as I am, he said, and I may say that I have lived to see 4 illustrious sovereigns occupy the throne. I have never taken part in a banquet which produced verses so spirited or dancing, and music so admirably performed. Talent of every description seems at present to exist in abundance, but it is creditable to those in authority that they knew how to make good use of it. For my part, I enjoyed myself so much that had I but been a few years younger, I would positively have joined in the dancing. No special steps were taken to discover the musicians, answered Genji. We merely used those who were known to the government in one part of the country and another as capable performers. If I may say so, it was Chujo's willow dance that made the deepest impression, and is likely always to be remembered as a remarkable performance. But if you, sir, had indeed honored us, a new luster would have been added to my father's reign. Aoi's brothers now arrived, and leaning against the balustrade, gave a little concert, their various instruments blending delightfully. Fugitive as their meeting had been, it had sufficed to plunge. The lady whose identity Prince Genji was now seeking to establish into the depths of despair. For in the 4th month, she was to become the heir apparent's wife. Turmoil filled her brain. Why had not Genji visited her again? He must surely know whose daughter she was, but how should he know which daughter? Besides, her sister Kokiden's house was not a place where, save under very strange circumstances, he was likely to feel at all at his ease, and so she waited in great impatience and distress. But of Genji there was no news. About the 20th day of the 3rd month, her father, the minister of the right, held an archery meeting at which most of the young noblemen and princes were present. It was followed by a wistaria feast. The cherry blossom was for the most part over, but 2 trees, which the minister seemed somehow to have persuaded to flower later than all the rest, were still an enchanting sight. He had had his house rebuilt only a short time ago, when celebrating the initiation of his granddaughters, the children of Kokiden. It was now a magnificent building, and not a thing in it, but was of the very latest fashion. He had invited Genji when he had met him at the palace only a few days before, and was extremely annoyed when he did not appear. Feeling that the party would be a failure if Genji did not come, he sent his son Shi no Shosho to fetch him, with the poem, "Were my flowers as those of other gardens, never should I have ventured to summon you." Genji was in attendance upon the emperor, and at once showed him the message. "He seems very pleased with himself and his flowers," said his majesty with a smile, adding, "As he has sent for you like this, I think you had better go. After all, your half-sisters are being brought up at his house, and you ought not to treat him quite as a stranger." He went to his apartments and dressed. It was very late indeed when at last he made his appearance at the party. He was dressed in a cloak of thin Chinese fabric, white outside, but lined with yellow. His robe was of a deep wine-red color, with a very long train. The dignity and grace with which he carried this fancifully regal attire in a company where all were dressed in plain official robes were indeed remarkable, and in the end, his presence perhaps contributed more to the success of the party than did the fragrance of the minister's boasted flowers. His entry was followed by some very agreeable music. It was already fairly late when Genji, on the plea that the wine had given him a headache, left his seat and went for a walk. He knew that his 2 step-sisters, the daughters of Kokiden, were in the inner apartments of the palace. He went to the eastern portico and rested there. It was on this side of the house that the wistaria grew. The wooden blinds were raised, and a number of ladies were leaning out of the window to enjoy the blossoms. They had hung bright-colored robes and shawls over the windowsill, just as is done at the time of the New Year, dancing and other gala days, and were behaving with a freedom of allure which contrasted very oddly with the sober decorum of Fujitsubo's household. "I am feeling rather overpowered by all the noise and bustle of the flower party," Genji explained. "I am very sorry to disturb my sisters, but I can think of nowhere else to seek refuge." And advancing towards the main door of the women's apartments, he pushed back the curtain with his shoulder. "Refuge indeed," cried one of the ladies, laughing at him. "You ought to know by now that it is only poor relations who come to seek refuge with the more successful members of their family. What, pray, have you come to bother us for?" Impertinent creatures, he thought, but nevertheless there was something in their manner which convinced him they were persons of some consequence in the house, and not, as he at first supposed, mere waiting women. A scent of costly perfumes pervaded the room. Silken skirts rustled in the darkness. There could be little doubt that these were Kokiden's sisters, and their friends, deeply absorbed, as indeed was the whole of this family, in the fashionable gaieties of the moment. They had flouted decorum and posted themselves at the window that they might see what little they could of the banquet which was proceeding outside, little thinking that his plan could succeed, yet led on by delightful recollections of his previous encounter. He advanced towards them, chanting in a careless undertone the song, "At Ishikawa, Ishikawa, a man from coma took my belt away." But for belt, he substituted fan, and by this means he sought to discover which of the ladies was his friend. "Why, you have got it wrong. I never heard of that," Korean one of them cried. Certainly it was not she, but there was another, who, though she remained silent, seemed to him to be sighing softly to herself. He stole towards the curtain of state, behind which she was sitting, and taking her hand in his, at a venture he whispered the poem, "If on this day of shooting my arrow went astray, 'twas that in dim morning twilight only the mark had glimmered in my view." And she, unable any longer to hide that she knew him, answered with the verse, "Had it been with the arrows of the heart that you had shot, though from the moon's slim bow no brightness came, would you have missed your mark?